Maayong hapon kanatong tanan. Welcome once again to the fourth installment of the Vicente Sotto lecture series. Now, for the benefit of those who've only joined us now, for the past couple of months, we've been hearing from esteemed researchers and writers. Last year, we heard from Dr. Erlinda Alburo, and after a few months hiatus, we resumed online with Dr. Russell Muharas, Professor Raymond Fernandez of UP Cebu, Mrs. Luella Eslao Alex, Dr. Christina Juan from the University of London, Dr. Jose Eliazar Bersales from the University of San Carlos, and last month with Mr. Dennis Hudilia, also from the University of San Carlos. Today we will be hearing from another esteemed writer. But before we get there, here to welcome us today and to officially open the program is the research assistant of the Cebuano Study Center, Mr. Charles Dominic Sanchez.
Thank you, Bea, and good afternoon, everyone. It was July of 2018 when I first mustered the courage to walk up to Larry Ypil, whose regular Sunstar column, Dog Ears in the Wrong Notebook, I chance upon every now and then back in my high school and college years, and whose name I'd heard frequently mentioned among the literary circles I'd orbit. This was the Saturday of the Lit Fest, and Sir Larry had just done a live interview for the 032 podcast. I watched and listened to the interview before purchasing one copy each of his debut collection, The Highest Hiding Place, and his chapbook, Night Report, which I would later learn was a sampler for his yet to be released follow up, and then walked up to him for the book signing. I introduced myself as a graduate student at USC, mentioned that he and I shared a few mutual friends, and Miss Hannah Gabales, who was also present, added that I was a student of Dr. Hope before being nice enough to take our picture together. After signing my copies of his publications, Sir Larry asked if I was available sometime the week after for coffee. The following Tuesday, Sir Larry and I met up at Balay Cafe along AS Fortuna, and for about 4 or 5 hours, we talked about a broad array of topics: our respective literary backgrounds, mutual acquaintances, art, politics, current events. Probably the only real kulo kabildo I've ever had with a more senior writer. In the course of this conversation, I found out that Sir Larry and I had a lot of things in common besides our being students of literature. For one, both he and I graduated from the same high school, and thus we knew several people outside local literary cliques, such as now retired teachers and long gone priest administrators. Sir Larry and I also briefly pursued graduate studies in fields that alums of our high school alma mater typically gravitate to, as these often lead to lucrative careers, medicine in his case, law in mine. I thus found it quite refreshing, empowering even, to come across a writer whose path into the literary life paralleled mine in more ways than one. Given our middle class private school upbringing, our choice of language for writing was English, which it goes without saying is a privileged language, often associated with economic opportunity and upward mobility. Personally, it took a while for me to even so much as become aware of this privilege and eventually learn to question it. Why did English and not, say, Spanish or Portuguese, or even a Southeast Asian language like Tagalog or Bahasa Indonesia, achieve such a status? Why were writers like Sir Larry and I writing in a language that originated from the other side of the globe? The answer lies in the confluence of historical factors that are often not discussed or glossed over in many of our classrooms, likely because the information in textbooks which teachers rely on are already greatly diluted or sanitized, and the teachers themselves are too saddled with work to consult additional sources. I was fortunate enough to have adept professors in grad school and also a reliable network of friends in the humanities who recommended to me several eye opening readings. Now, I can't speak for Sir Larry, and also because my poetic sensibilities are not as honed as I would like them to be, I haven't close read his works enough to come up with a fuller picture of him. Hence, I generally refer to the opinions of friends who are more attuned to verse. Probably during one of the last times, if not the last time, I saw her before the pandemic. A grad school classmate of mine remarked to me and another friend how radically different Sir Larry's two poetry collections, published 10 years apart, are. whereas the highest hiding place deals with topics of youth and comeuppance, leaning more toward the personal. 2019's Experiment of the Tropics, which Sir Larry will be getting into detail later, takes a broader bird's eye view on things. Said grad school classmate noted how it was more overtly political, exhibiting an awareness of one's place in society and history, which I suspect was achieved partly because of its use of old turn of the century Cebu photos. This difference that my classmate pointed out is the trajectory of only the most discerning of literary creatives. As any writer will tell you, the craft can at times be quite solitary and reclusive, resulting in self absorption or what critic Adele Garciliano has called a retreat from reality in the search for abstract or platonic themes. This can be especially true for Filipino writers in English, and I can attest to this myself, who tend to model their Western counterparts over fellow Philippine or post colonial talents, consequently distancing themselves from local realities and exhibiting an awareness or wariness or uneasiness when confronted with radical views, such as looking at history as a series of power struggles rather than mere factoids, as this will inevitably lead one to the harsh truth that English was forced on us, severing us from native sensibilities and driving deeper that wedge between intellectuals and the masses, which historian Renato Constantino once bemoaned. As we listen to Sir Larry's lecture this afternoon, and take a look at some of the photos he featured in Experiment of the Tropics, I hope we also use this time as an opportunity to not just gaze in awe at or momentarily reconnect with the past, but also muse on possibilities of what could have happened had certain historical happenings taken a different turn. Would we still have trains in Cebu, for example? Or would I perhaps be delivering this message in Cebuano because the Americans decided to give us the independence they promised, or at least opted for the use of local languages, which were flourishing at the beginning of the 20th century, as the medium of instruction in the public school system? Such thoughts may be the stuff of speculative or alternate history fiction, but they do help us look at our local community, our country, and the world under a whole new light. A light that is often obscured by privilege, but once grasped, reveals just how interconnected even the most seemingly unrelated or disparate phenomena are. Dear audience members, welcome to the April 2021 installment of the Vicente Sotto Lecture Series. May we all have an enlightening afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles, for that warm welcome. Indeed, I am really looking forward to this lecture. I recall meeting Larry also in a bookshop, same experience in the bookshop in Hongera a couple of years ago. But before we go to our lecture proper, we have invited Miss Annie Perez from UP Cebu to give us a brief primer on the legacy of Don Vicente Sotto, after whom this lecture series is named. Today, Miss Annie will focus on the Press Freedom Bill authored by Sotto. A little background, Annie graduated magna cum laude from the University of the Philippines, Cebu with a bachelor's degree in arts mass communication. She finished as top of her class in 2014. Right after college, she pursued a career as a TV reporter for ABS-CBN Cebu for 6 years. It was cut short as the Congress denied franchise to the network giant. Today, jumping off as a part-time lecturer in January 2020, Perez is now a full-time faculty for the College of Communication, Art and Design for UP Cebu as a way to give back to the university that honed her. She also writes an opinion columnist. She also writes as an opinion columnist for the Freeman and retains as ABS-CBN's correspondent for Cebu and other areas of Central Visayas. On the side, she runs a milk tea shop with some retrenched colleagues and friends. Please help me welcome Miss Annie Fe Perez.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Miss Bea, and thank you so much for having me this afternoon. I was really quite hesitant at first to say yes because this part of me, being part of the journalism field, I'm trying to not really shelve, but trying to get over the past and what has happened with ABS-CBN and the closure and the shutdown and the denial of the franchise. But I'm going to share to you how big the impact of the Shield Law that Vicente Sotto has authored in the past. So please allow me to share my screen. And I'm going to share to you how important it is in the time of the pandemic. Because when the pandemic started around January last 2020, we were still there. So we still were part of the gathering when the pandemic broke out here in the country. What are some of the words that you can associate with COVID-19? Maybe on top of your head, you have a lot of things that you can think of. Maybe if you have time to type in the chat box, you can tell me or share to the group what you can think of when you think about COVID-19. So while you're typing, maybe I'll show you a word cloud of some of the words associated with the virus. Symptoms, vaccine, which is the stage that we are now, acquiring vaccine in the vaccination program. We are seeing tests. We had a lot of various tests for if you're positive for COVID-19. There's the antigen test, the PCR, PCR test. We're seeing words such as symptoms, disease, and all these words we have been hearing since last year. So this is an illustration that I sourced from Tropical Med Health. It's a health journal of the first case in the Philippines. So it was on January 20 when this person from Wuhan traveled to Hong Kong and Hong Kong to Cebu, took a connecting flight to go to Dumaguete and stay there for about 3 days, and then went back. I went to Manila before leaving the country, and that was when they knew that this Chinese national was positive for COVID-19, and the country's borders were not closed yet at that time. And then you know what happened after that, cases upon cases, and now it has ballooned up to what it is today. And the result of the many cases that have multiplied because of that one case and the non-closure of the borders, we're experiencing the community lockdown, also known as community quarantine. There are different names and adjectives that the government has named it: enhanced community quarantine, modified enhanced community quarantine, general community quarantine, modified general community quarantine. They have included the adjective relaxed community quarantine. We also have heard of the grid lockdown, the cellular lockdown, surgical lockdown, and all those things that they could describe, but it's just really a lockdown. And we're in it for a year and give or take 5-6 months. And when the lockdowns were happening, the cases were rising, the hospitals were overwhelmed, where was the media? Where were we? Where was I? So we were at the forefront delivering the news, trying to adhere to strict social distancing while talking to people in the field. It was a really risky job while everybody was at home doing all their quarantine routines, their quarantine workout, dalgona coffee, cooking, gardening. We were there, we were out there talking to the people, trying to tell stories of what's really happening outside their homes and why you should stay at home. And also some of our programs, and then ABS-CBN Cebu followed the protocol. So we had shows where our hosts worked from home as well, and we used platforms such as Zoom to place them on air in the studio. And the picture on the right, that's us trying to show that we are also adhering to strict social distancing, and only 30% of us were allowed inside the station. Did the media help at the time when COVID was out there ballooning and the stories were overwhelming? Did we help? It could be a yes, it could also be a no, because some information led to fake news, which stirred and created alarm to a lot of people, like the controversial post of Maria Victoria Beltran, which she defended as a satire, and the LGU took it negatively. There are also those fake news of closure of borders when in fact there wasn't, and many other fake news that we saw on social media, and they're trying to attribute it to mainstream media, while the mainstream media who are doing their job are busy vetting and trying to verify all the information. So here comes the role of the Soto Law, which is also called the Press Freedom Law or the Shield Law. It said that it cannot be compelled to reveal the source of any news items, reports, or information appearing or being reported or disseminated through the media. Recently, it was amended to include digital media, but this does not cover those that concern the security of the state. So during the pandemic, how helpful it was. We were able to talk to patients without disclosing their names and their identities, because at that time, if you were COVID positive, it was a very sensitive thing. If you had the virus, a lot of people would judge you, would not want to talk to you, would not want to go near your house. Your family might be put in a bad light. So because of the Soto law, we were able to produce stories. We were able to put out voices of these people who are also sharing their story that if you're COVID positive, it's not an easy journey, especially if you have symptoms, especially when you're in the hospital. We were not compelled to introduce or to show their faces because of the law that protected them. And we also saw how it evolved. The stories of COVID has evolved to things like the community pantry that we see now and more. So what really is the role of a free press in a pandemic? Well, we correct all false notions and make sure that they are verified, and we are also concerned of the emotional and psychosocial aspects of our audience. And with the Soto law, we are able to do this very well. So these are the types of materials that we put out on a daily basis. These are some of the data. Here first. Hammercock made a survey in India that said about 87% of individuals are on their phones 8 hours a day during the lockdown. So if that's India, how much more the Philippines? So it's very important for all the journalists and for the media in general to make sure that their information are verified. And how can they do this with such liberty and such freedom if they are not able to protect their sources? And luckily we can. Another role of media, of free press in a pandemic, is that we can correct all false notions, keep up with verified information, and and I mentioned also the emotional and psychosocial aspects and tracking photos. This was the chart that I showed you earlier. And lastly, we can verify and create stories of certain drugs and talk about the efficacy of vaccines without having to worry about the people will be talking about it as long as they are legitimate. For example, the story of hydroxychloroquine. This was the drug at that time, at the height of COVID, that most of the hospitals and doctors use. So if we were not able to talk to patients who were administered this drug, maybe it would be very hard to talk about it and to make stories about it if it is really one of those drugs that help critical COVID patients. And now like I mentioned, we are at the stage of vaccination. We could not also get what were the initial reactions of those who were vaccinated. first, or now the senior citizens, what are their reactions, their adverse reactions to the vaccine? If some were compelled to really reveal who they were or their identity, and when they don't want to, it would be very hard to put a face, a human face, to these health issues. Another role also is public health communication on minimum health protocols. So, such as putting out PSAs on what to do, like social distancing and all the minimum health protocols. So, about to end. So, if it were not for him, maybe we have controlled information. It would be a very hard landscape for me. And maybe we would have limited reach because if you are suppressed or oppressed, it would be very hard to move around. You know, like a person being limited. There might be even chaos if this law was not passed because people could just muzzling at each other, and it would also be the death of press freedom. So that's why I think we are very lucky. While they are tagging the Philippines as one of the most dangerous places for journalists, I could also say that it's also one of the free. It's a free country for journalists based on my experience, especially in this pandemic. So what to take home from covering the pandemic and inculcating press freedom in it? For me, covering the pandemic is very rare. This is something that I would be telling my children and my grandchildren that a pandemic happened in my time and I was able to tell stories about it freely. But the freedom also has to be taken care of wisely so that the audience and the citizenry would be more informed and they would be proactive to the whole situation. And second, maybe we don't shoot the messenger at times because we are just doing our jobs and we are always attribute to our sources. Eventually, we don't name them because these are sensitive topics. You would know and understand why, but you would also get the gist and maybe still get some nuggets of wisdom from the stories that media are presenting to you. So don't judge and don't assume, don't shoot the messenger. And lastly, it is teaching us to be critical. This whole situation is teaching us to be critical. So let's not be alarmist. Let's not limit ourselves, but instead we should always look out for information that are verified because the Soto law has an impact on us that gives us so much, like what I mentioned, liberty, that we are indebted to give the right information out there because it's our responsibility as reporters. So we just want an informed citizenry in this time of a pandemic, and we are just so blessed and lucky to have this kind of law. So I think that's it, and the 15 minutes is up. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much, Miss Annie, for that discussion. Indeed, it's very interesting to see the legacy of Soto in action even during the time of the pandemic. And to show our appreciation for you very willingly and taking up our invitation, we would like to present our certificate of appreciation. Allow me to read the citation. The University of San Carlos Cebuano Study Center presents this certificate of appreciation to Anife Perez for her lecture entitled Press Freedom in the Time of a Pandemic during the Vicente Sotto Lecture Series 2021, given this 24th day of April 2021 via Zoom, signed by Father Jasraj Antoniapen, SVD, PhD, Vice President for Academic Affairs, and Dr. Hope Saban Panyu, Director of the Cebuano Study Center. A virtual round of applause, please. Thank you. And once again, daghan salamat. Now we've reached the most awaited part of our program. But before we get to that, I'd just like to remind everyone that later on an evaluation link will be posted in the chat box. Please make sure you fill it up so that you can receive your certificates of participation. And also, if you have any questions for our speaker, please post them in the chat box or save them for the live question and answer, which we will address during the open forum. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, or our speaker, Mr. Lawrence Ypil. Larry is a poet and essayist from Cebu. He is the author of The Experiment of the Tropics, which was a finalist for the Lambda Book Awards and longlisted for the Believer Book Awards. He received an MFA in poetry from Washington University in St. Louis and in nonfiction writing from the University of Iowa. His first book of poems, The Highest Hiding Place, was given the Madrigal Gonzalez Best First Book Award. His work has received the Academy of American Poets Prize, the Philippines Free Press Awards, and the Don Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards, among others. He is currently writing a book inspired by the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, which examines photographs and objects from the Philippine Exposition and explores the role of material culture in the construction of cultural identity and memory. He currently teaches creative writing at Yale NUS College in Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, a virtual round of applause, please, for our speaker, Mr. Larry Ipil.
Hello, hello. Thank you, Bea, for the very generous introduction. Um, yeah, before I start my talk, I think really warm thank yous need to be in order. I especially want to thank the two people who spoke right just before me. Thank you very much for Annie. For sharing that tidbit about Vicente Sotto. I didn't know about that, so it's been wonderful to get to know that he did sign out a law that is helping you as a journalist. I want to personally thank you for the work that you do. I think journalists are so important to our country, especially right now during the pandemic. And thank you so much for the work that you do and for sharing that with us this afternoon. Thank you also to Charles for giving a very warm and personal introduction. I was quite scared that Charles might reveal very private information that I wasn't ready to share, but I'm very glad that all information there is good for the public. Thank you so much, Charles, for that introduction. Before I start my talk, I wanted to thank the Cebuano Study Center of the University of San Carlos. I most especially want to thank Bea and Hope for the wonderful invitation to join this lecture series. I want to thank the people that I have been in touch with leading to today. Thanks, Bea, for coordinating this. Thank you, Charles, again for the introduction. And I know that, thank you to everyone behind the scenes that make this events like this possible. So thank you for the work that you do. Okay. I thought that for this afternoon, I would talk mostly about the book, The Experiment of the Tropics. I am anticipating that this will probably take, 15 to 20 minutes. I could be wrong, but I thought I'd keep the discussion and share some poems. But I'm mostly hoping that the audience this afternoon are willing and ready to engage with questions. I think there might be things that I am not able to bring up during the talk. So I wanted to be sure that I get to, respond to certain interests that you have. I know some of you might be writers, some of you might be academics and historians, and some of you are really just like lovers of poetry. So I want to be sure this Saturday afternoon is spent honoring all of those fields, the fields of history, the fields of art, and the fields of poetry. Okay. Um, when I was asked to give this talk as part of the Vicente Soto series, I thought it would be a great opportunity to thank the Cebuano Studies Center for the huge support it's given me and my writing, especially my last book, The Experiment of the Tropics. That book was literally made possible because of the center. I was back in Cebu for the summer I had received a small grant to write about the American period, and I had found an excuse to pester Hope and ask her about whether there were any archival photos at hand. I remember spending, because I'm a crammer, I remember spending 2 or 3 straight days in the Cebuano Study Center. It was already in Talamban, right before flying out back to the US. And I was laying out these photographs on the table. I was taking pictures of pictures. Um, and just to give you a sense of how fast technology has changed in even just a few years, I remember taking those pictures of pictures with my brown digital camera. So it was still a digicam, and it has since been lost to a pickpocket in Europe. The Experiment of the Tropics, simply put, is a book of poems and lyric essays that are built around the photographs. What I also thought might be good to share this afternoon were some of the things that I discovered in the writing of the book. What it meant to write from and with these photographs, what it meant to work and think about the archives, to write poetry from these images of the past, what it meant to move between eye and ear and page, to sing a song in the mind, in the face well of a face, a dress, the chin of a stranger, a hat. I have mentioned this in previous interviews. Um, in many ways, the experiment of the tropics is a failure of history, or at least history as we usually understand it. I very quickly realized as I began looking at and writing about the photographs that I wasn't very interested in the usual questions. Who were these people? What were their names? When was this taken? What is that tree? Whose father is this? Are they living or dead? Are they living or dead? Are they living or dead? You could tell all historians would already be shaking their heads. If I were a novelist, you might say there might have been a chance that I would have been interested in these questions too, the building blocks of character and setting and plot. But I wasn't a novelist. I was a poet, which was a way of saying that I was interested in sentiment, in stillness. I was interested in music and what it is that a fold of a fold of a fold of a dress is, and the hand of a man beside it, off center and blurred. Is that a smirk? I see the woman, yes, but maybe we can talk about her skirt a bit. So I was obviously asking the very wrong questions that a historian might ask, or even like a literary or a cultural critic. I was interested, in other words, in what my wayward eyes might catch, what occupied the edges of the intention of the photograph, that fulcrum of attention, that center of the hall or the house or the living room sala. But is that a fan left unfurled on a chair on the side? Not the face, but the shoe. And what is that? And that? And that? Roland Barthes, who is a French critic, calls this the punctum. He says this is the part of the photograph that, for one reason or the other, catches our attention. It grips our gaze, as opposed to the photograph's studium. So there were two terms he talks about. There's the punctum and then there's the studium. So as opposed to the photograph's studium, he calls it the official meaning, meaning the reason for the photograph's taking, meaning a building, a mother, a group of boys, whatever the reason we take a photograph for. For him, the punctum was that which locked our looking, even if it had nothing really to do with the rest of the photograph. So if you were to look at my screen, it might be, the potted plant at the back. It might be the pillow at the back over my shoulder. It might be the blinds here to my left. It would be the things in the photograph that were on the edge of what we think the photo was really about. So it was, these were the things that really had nothing to do with the rest of the photograph. The parting of a hair, the flaking paint off the banister. But in that manner, these details, this punctum, punctured our very being. It hurt us, if you will. And in effect, it made the photograph, any photograph, inevitably unforgettable. We remember most our wounds. We remember most our wounds. Sorry, when I was editing this lecture yesterday, when I got to that line, I had to stand up and get coffee. But it really made me think that, the punctum, the puncture, the wound of a photograph, the thing that did not really have anything much to do with the photograph, but was the one thing that we noticed, the one thing which punctured us, was actually the point, the punctum of the photograph. We remember most our wounds, but we also, I would like to think, remember most the stories half told that make up the blurry edges of what we think we know, the shadows facts make across the page, the speculations we are forced to build because of time lost around the documents in a museum, the photographs in a family album. We could know more, and a true historian certainly will find out more. But I'm wondering about the parts of ourselves that are perfectly content with not knowing the full story. I'm thinking about the video some of you might have caught right before the talk on the Cebuano Study Center. It makes me think about the archives and the way institutions like these, are meant to collect, preserve, but also like to increase knowledge. But as a poet and as a writer, I'm also quite interested in the things that we don't entirely know. And while a historian is making sure that we know as much that we can know, I wonder if as a poet, I was quite interested in the opposite, that I am perfectly actually content with not knowing everything about the story. Holding a photograph in bed, flipping the face of a stranger, black and white and long dead, while we lay with our legs crossed on some deep, deep night of no sleep, we could say to ourselves, I could find out more, first thing tomorrow morning. But there is also a part of us that says, I'm actually okay. And I wonder if that part that says, like, actually, I'm okay with that knowing, I wonder if that is the part that writes the poetry. I'm going to read a few poems from the book. I also thought I would share some of the photos that were all taken from the Cebuano Study Center. For those of you who have not seen these photos, consider these as invitations to drop by San Carlos. I don't know if COVID restrictions dili na pwede, no? Pero once the pandemic is over, I hope those photographs become accessible to the public again. So give me a minute. I think it's important for this lecture that you get a sense of what I'm talking about and what it looks like. Wait lang ha, I will look for it. Okay. Give me a minute. Reshare it. Wait lang. Okay. Do you all see this? Kita? Yeah? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Great. This is the cover of the book. Um, it's like a deconstructed map of our country. I requested that Cebu be a bit in the center, right on top of the experiment. So I'll show some pictures. I won't talk too much when I'm showing these. I think it's yeah. Just look at them. I'm a huge fan of the white suit. So this is the era of the white suit. The pure confidence of wearing a white suit in the tropics. I think nga dili mahugaw. How does love begin? How does love begin? By song and dance, by chance. There is a song, and the woman steps up to the podium. For every song of loss, there is a song of redemption. For every woman, there is a man who stands behind her looking at his fingers while he strums a guitar, knowing his music is background to her voice, so he keeps it on the low side. Longing is a head turned away towards a century. Singing needs a somewhere else across an ocean beyond a mountain. Meanwhile, a lark sitting on a bough sings over and over till we sleep. Meanwhile, a woman and a man step on stage, the woman to sing, the man on his strings, even if this time around they do it not for love or devotion, but for stereo. For the first time in the city, the stage that is here becomes elsewhere by airwave and speaker. Now we are all in this together on our feet, in our sleep. A wind enters and does not leave. The first time I received a letter from a boy, he asked, "When can I kiss you?" Now we will never be alone. A man will pause for effect. A woman will breathe before the high note, almost simultaneous. In the time it takes. In the time it takes for the shadow of the world to reach the shadow of the knee of the woman sitting in the park under a tree, a photograph is developed. Drip, drip, splash, then all right, then a dry mount against the wet, wet grass. When the city's architects asked what could be done with the past, they didn't anticipate glass. They believed the ocean, with its endless shimmer of always, would make the Dane denizens of the city stick from squinting at the sea. What reprieve the streets could be, what rain falling endlessly from the eaves of shop houses as a line of trees becomes the token gesture nature makes to signify an elsewhere here where a woman slowly rises to become the shadow of a shadow of me. Where is the goddess? Where is the goddess in the crook of a finger, in the chink of a cup, in the outline of an arm seen briefly by slant of light? In the painting, at least, she held the hand of her sister by the banister. Somewhere else, summer and fall. Somewhere else, mud stuck on the soles of shoes. You needed a branch to pry it loose. A bouffant was a way to hold her hair in place in the face of history. A dress to lay a flower on, so petal to petal became both lover and not there, lying on the grass, a skirt as foliage and wind. So hold your gaze, dear stranger, pointing to no one in particular here. I broke my heart, said the man in rattan. I broke my heart, said the man in rattan, as he sang a song in clippings. How special it was, that feeling to be broken, a clutter of things that could become the pretext for a painting of place. If only it held him, twig to needle to groove. A public loneliness made mainstay to the day itself, so the inside became the outside to be seen by the shape of a shell battered and bent on a wall to become decoration. How fortunate to be gathered, he thought, as if by accident. There was a chair to sit on. There was a shirt. This is one of my favorite photographs that I found in the center. I've talked about this a bit in other lectures, but I am obsessed with the distance between this guy's ear and the petal, the flower that is right beside his ear. The distance between that flower and his right ear, I think that is, I mean, that is where the poetry is. It's the punctum for me. In the manner of thinking that is the thinking of the boy sitting on a chair with his legs crossed, believing this is what thinking does, resting his elbow on his knee, staring at the ground, pretending this is what looking does to looking. In the garden, the photographer held the flower by its stem, while the maid, thinking this was what believing meant, looked into the distance of herself while tilting her head to that vine of hesitation to be touched, as some men might brush their arms against each other without looking at themselves in the eye. And in this way was the camera invented. Um, I would be glad to talk about some of these poems more in depth later on in the if there is time. Wanted to say though that many of the poems in the book interrogate some of our questions on the American period. So you know most of these photographs are really taken from the early 20th century. The librarians here might correct me, but I think most of them are really like 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. Um, and maybe that's indicative of like photographic history in Cebu. I also got the sense that these photographs felt like they were either official photographs, so a lot of them were about were landscape scenes. And also a lot of them were like from prominent and wealthy families. So I got the sense that they were either official photographs of the city or they were donations that were made to the center during this time. I think Risil might have the answer to all of this. Um, Maybe let's look at a few more photographs. I feel like just to give you a sense, a bit more of what this collection is like. Some of these photos I wrote poems about, others I really just like kept at hand while writing the book. You have the fathers on the top floor, right behind the ventanilla. Looks like a town fiesta, right? I mean, this looked like a town fiesta. Uh, or really something big, I think, because everyone seemed to be in white suits. So like super formal wear. So this really might have been a super important event. I suspect if someone recognizes the tree in this photo, we might be able to locate where exactly this happened. I suspect this tree is still there. I wonder if this is City Hall. Um, some of the plays that were Teatro Jonquera, I think. Yeah. Maybe someone later can actually identify this church. Kung asa ni siya. Maybe you can write it in the chat box. This is Magallanes Street, post-World War, 1945. I'm really struck by the telephone poles here. They seem very lonely. Uh, they're jutting out into the skyline. It's church again. This might be Fort San Pedro. Uh, might be taken from the Plaza Independencia. Again, the historians would confirm that. So, here we get the sense that some of these photographs came from the Vélez collection. I wonder if that was like a formal collection or whether that was just like a personal collection of the Vélezes. Okay. Um, yeah. So yeah, a lot of these poems were and photographs were really about the American period, which, as you would know, is usually taught to us as peacetime. Um, what writing about this period and researching around it permitted me was to revisit these assumptions of peace and uncover through poetry the violence that actually permeates through this period. Photographs conceal as much as they reveal. And part of the sheen that they make both cover and uncover the violence and labor and the silencing that comes with the establishment of empire. They reveal only half of the story. And I feel like part of the job of poetry has always been, for me, its willingness to bear witnesses to the intricacies of this history. Poetry is willing to look at the button and the hole in the face of the dress. When I wrote this book, I was interested in the ways we could build on the cultural and historical institutions of Cebu. So that's the other reason why I was really excited to work on this. How might we respond and build on the work already paved, for example, by Dr. Resil Mujares? How do we build on the Cebuano Studies Center? I was interested especially in the ways writing and art could build on and complicate the conversation surrounding the archives. The wonderful thing about things is that they live much longer than the circumstances that produce them. A comb always lasts longer than the head of hair that may now be buried in the ground. That is the givenness of time. What interests me in poetry then are the ways in which the archives can be seen not just as a repository of the past, but really as a mode of talking about the present. In what ways do they reveal not facts, but ways of looking that we embody when we hold a book or gaze at photographs or enter old houses? What is revealed about ourselves as we look into these rear view mirrors? The other pleasure of writing this book was that it gave me an excuse to visit my uncle in Danao, who is the one who lives in the old Ypil house, which is built before the war. Some of us here today come from such houses. Sometimes we live in them, sometimes we are passing by. It is always my hope that writing is a way of blowing the dust off the shelves a bit, a way of causing a ruckus, tipping an old vase, asking nosy questions, tinkering with a watch that no longer works. Some of us here will want to fix the watch. Some of us here are fine just wearing that watch, even if it doesn't really tick. Write it. Um, and I kind of end there. I thought I would read maybe just two more poems, um, and then we can go to Q&A if some of you want to ask questions. I don't know if like it's it's Saturday afternoon, um, and I just shared like poems that might be very very heavy. Um, but I thought I really wanted to give you a sense. Can I just say like some of those poems I read I've never read before because I always think they're difficult. But then I thought like this is Cebu. Cebuanos can handle this. So like I just went for it. I hope that was a good introduction to you um, to the kind of writing I do, to the kind of poems that I do. I hope you got a sense of the music that I bring into my work. I hope you get a sense of how confusing they can be. I'm always interested in poetry that is not very clear about what it wishes to say, but is very clear about what it is, and it's just kind of like it just wants to be there for us. So I wanted to be sure you got a sense of that. Maybe I'll read two poems. I don't know if they're any lighter, um, but maybe just two more, and then if you have questions, yeah, type it in the chat box, or like I'd love to have a conversation with you. This is on page 56 for those of you with the book. I'll share the screen again because this is in response to one of the photos. This is called Standstill Stasis. The way the river carried a boat, the way a boy and his shimmer stood at the edge of the stream unthinking. Before the invention of the telephone, before the construction of the tram that would take the flowers down from that mossy mountaintop to that sweltering town. It takes a man willing to walk up and down a village to determine how long it will take the aster to wilt in the neighbor's garden inside a vase. There is a fruit plucked without asking, like a letter stuffed with one's thoughts, fresh as the underbelly of not say, unbruised, unpromised. After the war was lost, after the refrigerator upon invention was defrosted. And one last, sorry. This one is partly inspired by the aunts. My aunts, they were the sisters of my dad. They lived in. So these are not them. Um, I think this might be the Cuencos even. Some of you might recognize who they are. But as you can tell, I was using these photographs to elicit from me to my own family memories. And part of the memories that were elicited during the writing of this book were of my aunts, my dad's generation. They were the older sisters of my dad. They were school teachers. I feel like part of the reason why I'm a teacher now is both like a curse and a blessing from them. It's payback to them. Um, yeah, there are. This one's called playfully. There are 14 ways. There are 14 ways to say I might, 50 ways to turn the tide, two kitchens, one of them dry. There is a picture of a room, within a brightly lit afternoon where my aunt sat staring at the bougainvillea until the day it died. She fell to the ground 3 times, but then stood up while the men in the kitchen sat after the meal had been set, eyeing the silver she had gathered, the lacquer, 13, 14. She began each morning with hot water. She lived on a diet of fish. There was a chair, but she didn't sit on that. She was my aunt. I'll end there for now. Thank you for listening for the past few minutes. Um, Let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Sir Larry, for that lecture, for the
Well,
images that you provoked and evoked, and the thought provoking questions that you threw out at us today. Your entire lecture felt like a really long, beautiful poem. I agree with Miss Anna Canlas on the chat box. It was a treat to have a poetry reading on a Saturday afternoon. It has been beautiful to read and listen to Cebu as a poem, as a musical poem. So thank you very much. We've also asked the audience here to type in their questions in the chat box, and there are a couple of them. So we'll try to accommodate all of them within our time. So I'd like to start with Sir Charles' question. I'm curious about the ethics of writing about people whom you opted not to further research about. Were you concerned that your poems might encroach on or make too many presumptions about the lives of the subjects of these portraits? Or were you concerned that some criticisms of this collection would be raised in this regard?
thanks for the question. I feel like it's asking kung nahadlok ba ko nga makiha, no? Uh, was I afraid of being, sued for libel? Maybe the journalist should answer this question. It wasn't. I mean, very slyly. I think that's one of the the pleasures and the advantages of poetry, maybe, uh, that it can resist maybe such accusations of like that is not true or that you were false. At which point the poet always says like, but that was just a point, you know. So there was something always like interesting and sly with the genre that I and the form of poetry that I kind of really like. I don't think I did it out of fear though. I don't think the decision to avoid that research was done out of fear. I like I mentioned in the talk, I suspect it has something to do with my liking and writing poetry. I think if I were an essayist or I was writing full length essays, or if I was trying to write a novel, I think I would have dive deep into like who were they, what were their names, and what were the actual historical circumstances. So it actually for me brings up the question of like what genre are you writing? what do you wish to write, and how can that shape the kind of research that you do. So I like to think na we're taught man good of research usually as related to critical and academic paper. That's why sometimes for those of you who are creative writers, sometimes we think that in order to research for a novel, we need to research like it's for like a paper or a college paper. And I think that while the skills of the academic paper are valuable, I think writing creatively calls for a different kind of research also. I'm reminded of the American writer Eula Biss, Eulabiss, Eula Biss. She's an essayist, and I'm remembering I attended one of her talks, and she was calling it instead of research. She says it's just sorry, it yeah instead of research, it's search. Um, when you're doing research, you already have a question in mind, and you're diving into the archives because you're looking for the answer to that question. Whereas if you are searching instead of researching, what you are doing is opening things up. And I remember Eula Biss saying that for her it's that visit to the library where you have the call number, you know exactly the book you want, but then you're finally in the shelves. And for all of us here who are readers, we know this feeling. We actually don't borrow the book that we thought we would borrow. We would borrow the book right beside it because it had a more interesting title, right? So it's that kind of it's the surprise of research. It's the good timing of it, and it comes not because we knew the call number, or it comes not because we have like a thesis question already. It comes because we went on a search and we kind of like discovered something on the way. And I think the creative writer is impelled by that impetus more than anything. So there's necessarily a certain amount of discovery. You know.
Thank you, Sir Larry. I'd also like to acknowledge and say hi to a college classmate, Miguel. Hi, Miguel. It's nice to see you here. I'm gonna read your question next. I've also been reading your poetry on Facebook, and I've been following it, and it's also very beautiful. So, Sir Larry, this question is from Miguel. I love the music of the poem. I am now very curious the way you read them versus how the poems appear on the page. I initially thought or read the poems with caesuras as pauses, but listening now, are the spaces also punctures or fragmentations?
Yes. Thanks for picking that up, Miguel. The How to explain it? I feel like the usual comment I get when people hear me read is, oh, that's how it's supposed to sound. Like, so like they read it on the page, and then they, for some reason, it's either a poetry reading or a book lunch, they get to hear me read. And they're like, oi, that's how it's supposed to sound. And many of them actually say that they enjoy the poem more having heard it than just reading it on the page. So I don't know whether to take these comments as as negative or positive. Because on one hand they're saying just like you didn't write it correctly. Like well, how come it's not clear on the page? But I would hopefully like to think that what they're actually latching on is that there's a full range in the possibilities of a poem. And for those of us who are primarily page writers, then it's really the visual element that we're playing around with. How the poem looks on the page. Some of us really like it really hapsay and orderly. Some of us like it fixed form because it needs to be neat, and all the lines need to like be in the same. And for those of like who love messes, then we can't stand that, and the page needs to be like messy. If maybe I can, for those with, I'll show you how some of the poems look, because some of them are really all over the page. Um, so they don't really follow the usual look of the poem. And that's one thing I was kind of playing around with this book. A lot of the poems have just like phrases and words all over. I was interested in where the eye would look. So by blowing up the words, actually, the I, when we're looking at the poem, we can now like hover around it, and we're not too set to read the sentence as a sentence. And in that way, by fragmenting it, the eye was roving around the page in a way not usual. I was interested in that because I felt like that was the same kind of eye movement that we give to a photograph. When we're looking at a photograph, we don't like look at a photograph from like top to bottom, right? There is no order to the looking of a photograph. We gaze over it, and whatever we latch upon, that's where we linger. And there was a part of me that felt that blowing things up allowed for that eye movement. As a result of that lingering or like gazing over, you're also able to like construct new sentences, right? So like instead of just going from like left to right, because it's blown up a bit, in your mind at least, you can like, create weird sentences because the sentences have been blown up. So that was the thing, visually. I feel like I haven't answered the question yet. In terms of reciting it, though, I think because I liberated the words a bit from their stanza form, it also permitted me to recite them a bit more liberally. um, I think I was more and more interested in jazz. The older I got, I was interested in improvisation. And I sometimes feel that when I'm reading a poem out loud, it almost feels like I'm reading a set of musical notes, and I'm a singer kind of like riffing off those notes. So even if I don't really follow what the notes said, a huge part of it is dictated by the moment. So I might prolong a certain moment, or I might hasten the reading of one part. Yeah, yeah. And sometimes it's really also just like I'm bored with the poem already. Like, like I've read it before and I just want to try something new. So that's part of it. I feel like the spoken word poets know what I'm talking about. Like, you're dictated by the rhythm of it. I have never really done spoken word. I think this is the closest I will get to it. But I do enjoy saying things out loud. Yeah.
Thank you, Sir Larry. To anyone in the audience, if you want to respond to Sir Larry or ask a question live, you can just do the hand feature on the reaction button so that I can call your name. So we have another question from Oscar. You mentioned Studium and Punctum by Barthes. I was wondering how you incorporate Walter Benjamin's concept of the aura in your poems.
Oh, um, oh, I feel I'll need to write a critical paper to respond to that question. Huh? Thank you for bringing up that question. This is testing my sense of Walter Benjamin. So I'm not too familiar with Benjamin. What I do remember of his concept of the aura has to do with, correct me if I'm mistaken, but it has to do with like the idea of an original object,
Mm.
right? The aura of the original. Sakto ba be? Am I still? I feel like I need to review my grad notes. Sakto no. Benjamin talks about the aura as that.
Murag translations lost in translation. The
No,
original.
if there's a copy of a copy, then it loses its aura, right? And we imagine that there is an original
Mm.
art object, and the aura of that original art object is the aura is only in the original.
Mm.
I haven't thought about it that intently, but it reminds me of some of the things I was thinking about when writing this. I mean, photography, and another thing that Benjamin writes has to do with like the age of mechanical reproduction, right? What it means to live in a century and in a time where our notion of something, we know something can get replicated, and how does that shape our sense of reality? For Benjamin, I think the photograph was an important medium for that. The fact that photographs can be replicated, The fact that I took these photos using a digicam, so I was taking photos of photos, and just to let you know, what I did was I actually printed out those photos. So I have them around. So like I carried them. I'm very old school. So very like unsa ba na, millennial ba na, or like very hipster, no? So I printed them out. I carried them around on my trips back and forth. I hand carried them. It was important for me to have them have weight. I also felt that it was important that I could flip them around versus like just looking at the screen on my phone like that, or even on a computer where I would click and point and click on a file. There was something about the materiality of the writing of this was that was very important to me. A part of me felt that I needed to approximate how people in this period were looking at the photographs, that they were not looking at it on phones or screens, that they were holding it up and looking at it. Um, I love the fact that they could be lost. Um, so yeah, so those are the material things that really shaped the writing of it, of this book. I don't think I was too concerned with the idea of like the aura of the original. um I even wonder whether in the world we live in today, whether that aura matters anymore. um I'm remembering a moment of finally seeing Gustav Klimt in Vienna, like the kiss, and we grow up surrounded by the images of the kiss. And you would think that by making a pilgrimage there, it would be this like OMG moment of like, oh my God, I am finally looking at the kiss. And when I got there, it was just like complete disappointment because there were like a million other little versions of the kiss being sold in the tourist shop below. In the all the keychains, there were T-shirts of it. So Murabitag, the original, was in the midst of all these copies, and it almost felt like a bad joke that there would still even be relevance for the source. And I know a sentiment like that really kind of contests our notion of history and the archives. Because I think the archives, for example, is really based on the idea that there are original things, right? So the original photographs are only in Cebu, they're only in Talamban. And because there's COVID, we don't have access to them, and maybe if you visit, you will be filled by that moment of like, oh my God, I'm finally holding the photos that Larry talked about 3 years ago. So I don't know if that moment will still exist, but um, I think we grew up where copies of copies are a given. I don't know if we are as sentimental as a previous generation. Some of us are. Most of us are not, I suspect. But it makes me wonder if meaning is not to be found in that original object. Where then is it to be found? You know, where do we find our notions of meaningfulness? When do we feel like, oh, this is it? Versus like, kopya raman na, that's not it. You know, yeah. So I don't know. I feel like I did the worst teacher thing. I answered a question by just throwing back a question back at you. But I hope that stimulated you enough.
Thank you, Sir Larry. I see Henry raising his hand. Uh, but before I call Sir Henry, let me just read a follow up from Oscar. To be specific, expressing the details that get lost in translation when one tries to capture a certain moment using a camera. Would that be expressed poorly in poetry, or basically trying to express something that's not obviously seen?
Hmm. And okay. No, I feel like no, that's a good point because I feel like it puts into question then like why write a poem? Diba, Marag, what can the poem do then in the face of a photograph? Right? Is the poem meant to be is the poem's function that of accuracy or filling in the blanks? And I think with my poems, I wasn't too interested in that capacity. I think poetry has a way of staying on the surface and kind of just like playing there and just like shuffling things around. So, like I described in the talk, sometimes it's just, the figure of a boy looking at a photograph and not really knowing what he's looking at, but he's still looking at it, right? And I wonder if poetry, because it's light, because it, deals with surfaces, is that's the kind of encounter it can give to photography.
Thank you, Sir Larry.
Naunsa naman ni Benjamin naman ta. I like the questions though. Thank you very much. There's
Um,
there's
yes, go ahead.
so there's one more in the chat box. Was there like is it from a Jennifer?
Let me read what Jennifer read. Jennifer is a student in literature in the University of San Carlos. Narratives can make us understand. Photographs do something else, they haunt us. From Susan Sontag regarding the pain of others.
Can I ask Jennifer to murag nagklase naman hinoon, no? I don't, yeah, if you're willing, Jennifer, to talk a bit. I'm just interested why you bring this beautiful quote up. If you're willing. If you're not, that's fine also, but I thought if you it would
Yes,
be good.
Jennifer, you can unmute or you can post it here. Jennifer is actually a wonderful student and a very avid reader. With really, she has really read a lot, and I mean a lot. So Jennifer, you can unmute or you can post something here.
Yeah. No, I'm interested in what your thoughts are, Jen.
I saw her unmute. We'll just wait a few minutes, or we'll just wait a while. Jennifer is also a writer. Oh, she she's no longer in the list. Maybe she has bad connection because she recently went home
Okay.
to Samar and she's been telling me that her connection is not very
Yeah.
good.
Do we maybe give a few minutes for her to join back?
Yes.
Yeah,
When Jennifer gets back, I will call her.
yeah. Or let me know because I do want to respond to the quote. So I want to be sure I do that while she's in the room. Or
Okay, so,
maybe you scared her off. I'm so sorry for
okay, while waiting, let me oh, Jennifer is here. Okay, she's back.
maybe I can quickly respond to it.
Okay.
Yeah, she's having a bad connection. No, no, that's a lovely quote. I didn't know that quote from Sontag. The idea of haunting, it makes me think poetry is where the haunting is. If narratives seek to understand, then poetry is like photography is the haunting. So in a way, like I feel like photographs are very close to poems, and poetry is very close to photography. Um, Maybe the correlative of that would be like film, no? So films are very close to novels, whereas poems are close to photographs. I think it has to do with, for me, it has to do with the stillness of it, that these are static art objects, and that poetry is, in a way, a very static form. When we read poems, we are encouraged to go back and forth, beginning and end. I think it's valuable to actually see it on the page. Okay, the eye bitaw is going back and forth. You would never read a novel like that. A novel always insists that you move forward and you read linearly. There is something in poetry that actually encourages us to move back and forth. And sometimes it's because we don't understand it, right? Like unsa man eh? So we go back and forth. And that reverberation, I think, is very important to poetry. The same thing with photography. I think, the way our eyes are roving around it, the same way with the way we're reading a poem. These are primarily, for me, static art objects, and we are the ones that are moving around it. That's why I'm not a very good watcher of film, actually. I always feel like film is passive. Kanang you're sitting down and it's the film that's coming to you, right? It's the film that's moving. And you're just receiving it. I've always been more fascinated with things like photos and paintings where that's the static one and I'm the one moving around. So I don't know, maybe we're the one haunting it, like we're the ghosts haunting the photographs. We like to think the past is haunting us, but maybe it's us haunting the past. Just to respond to that haunting.
Thank you, Sir Larry. Jennifer just told me that she gets kicked out every time she unmutes her microphone. Okay. But she was able to hear your response.
Okay.
So let me call on Henry. I saw Henry was raising his hand a while ago.
Is Henry in the room? Is this the Henry I know?
Or maybe Henry also gets there.
Hi. Lars, I'd
Uh,
like hi Lars. I'd like you to comment on how people bring out information in this day and age of Instagram and Facebook, where there are posts and then there are stories, the permanence, well, the semi-permanence and impermanence of them. Yeah.
yeah. No, I love that question. It's the question of like, what will you post in Instagram story versus like, what will you post in the post? Um, which kind of like, really brings out this question of like transience and temporality. Um, what are things which hold value because they do not last? And they have precise value because we know that, in an Instagram IG story, that's 24 hours only, right? And how different is the thrill of reading that versus the thrill of reading up an Instagram post? Or I think the thrill is more with the one posting, no? Na marag, what will I post in this Instagram story that I will not commit to too much, and I will only commit to 24 hours, so that if it's potentially incriminating or embarrassing, it will fade into the ether where all things internet fade. Whereas like the Instagram post for me is so much about the curation of the self. It's so much about like what's the self image that I want to project, and it's a bit more permanent. But yeah, it's like you're saying. I think it brings up questions of time, no, and the relationship of time to value. Um, what is lasting, what is not lasting, what is momentary versus what will stay. I'm even wondering, sorry, I'm thinking of Oscar's question. I wonder if that has replaced the aura. So we're not, the aura of the original object. So we're not too concerned of finding the original object because everything will be reproduced anyway. But I'm wondering if the aura, or we find meaningfulness or pleasure based on time. It's a different pleasure. It's the pleasure of a 24-hour conversation versus the pleasure of someone that you will see every day. It's the pleasure of commitment and non-commitment. I think things like that. No judgment on either side, but they're very different. And these are questions of time.
Thank you. Sir, Oscar is raising his hand.
Hmm.
Hi, sir. Can you hear me? Okay, I was just like trying to make a clarification about my question. So, since you mentioned about music and poetry, uh, I I happen to be a film composer. So, I write music for film, and then most people would think that when you write music for film, it's just gonna parrot whatever is happening on the scene. But most of the time, it's not the case because when you write music, you're basically telling a story that's not being told in the picture per se. So it's part of the whole narrative, but at that certain moment, it's not being shown in the picture. So in connection with my question, I was wondering if poetry can do something like that. Say if you're writing about photograph or you know.
Definitely. Great point. I feel like poetry and music in your case offers like a para narrative. It's a parallel narrative. And sometimes it's in conjunction, sometimes it's in opposition. I find that the most interesting poems are those when the meaning of the poem is radically different from the music of the poem. So there are poems, for example, where it's a very like chill, I love you kind of poem, and then the music actually is very violent and unharmonic. That's when I feel most powerful poetry comes from. That takes skill though. I mean that takes a lot of skill, that takes an ear, where the music is saying something different than what you think the content is saying. Um, Same thing I think with the film, right? There is the acoustic narrative and then there is the visual narrative, and sometimes they match, but in interesting cases they don't match. It's also coming to mind like what poems about art are usually called ekphrastic poems. There's a whole genre of them, and it's making me wonder like what are good ekphrastic poems versus bad ekphrastic poems, or at least like what's interesting, not interesting. And for me, the not interesting ones are when the poems are really just saying what we could otherwise see. So Murag, let's just look at the painting or the photograph, if the poem doesn't really add anything much. So you know that it's the dynamic between media, music, film, photograph, words. And the more interesting the dynamic is, the more friction, I think, the better. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank
thank you, Sir Larry.
you.
Thank you, Oscar. I'd like to read Sir Michael Carlo Villa's uh, post. Hi, Larry. I have no question, just a comment. I like your use of the punctum, which to me is the space of the space the imagination fills. In the case of the well-dressed boy sitting with legs crossed, it is the distance between stray flower and the boy's ear. I think that's what your poetry does. Your poetry, which to me is basically a poetry of place.
Wow, thank you very much, Michael. I uh, mura ko naabli. Wait. No, because I really am beginning to wonder now, like where is the poetry? Is it in the flower or is it in the ear? Right? And poetry it's in the space in between. Right? That's how I feel. Like that's poetry is not in the flower or just in the ear. Poetry is in the gap between the two. This is a bit a different topic, but I'm suddenly reminded about because of the lockdown. So no travel. I haven't been back to Cebu in more than a year. And I'm finding it really hard to write. And I'm trying to figure out why it's hard for me to write. And I think it's because my writing comes from being back and forth. My writing comes not from Cebu, or it comes not from wherever I am. My writing comes from the back and forth. So in terms of almost like, so I'm gonna nerd out. In terms of like physics, it is like a kind of like pendulum, and of back and forth, away and here, there and here. I notice I write best when I'm on the move or just fresh from a move. So I write best on the first 4 days I'm in Cebu, and I write best when I'm in the last 4 days before I fly back out. And I suspect it's because the energy of my writing is because of that back and forth. But because I have not been able to do that, I'm finding it very, very difficult to find creative, poetic energy. Murag, I can't locate it. Murag bitaw dead air. Murag namatay ang makina. So parang, murag I don't have that energy. So I'm very, very curious how I'm reacting creatively because since I don't have that luxury of travel, I must find other sources of energy or inspiration or stop writing. You know, um, uh, uh, writing always comes from something. So I feel like mine comes from a back and forth. I have no idea how we got there. I feel like I was answering a space. See, Michael was asking about poetry of place. Because I think when we think of poetry of place, it assumes that we stay in one place and that we have a place called home. And poetry is about that home. But I would like to think we can complicate it a bit. Place can be something we are not in, but think of place as something that we really want to get to, but will not ever be there. Place is travel, places that we only go through for 5, 6 days and then we leave it. Place is not static. Place is very dynamic and imaginative.
Thank you, sir. Another question from Ms. Padin. Good afternoon. I would like to ask Sir Larry if punctum could be used as a way to process something different in architecture, like here in Karkar City. Ang uban kay naguba na og hinay-hinay and ang uban kay used for commercial use.
Huh. Now I want to hear more from the one who asked the question. Uh, can we invite him or her to in if they can or
Yes, let me see.
Okay, good afternoon, Sir Larry. Good
how,
afternoon.
how do I call you? Do you go by Padden or?
I am Beverly. You can call me Beverly. It's more on because I am doing a research on arts and culture. Actually, my thesis is on Linambay, and when you mentioned about photographs as not about facts, but about what could be like, let's say what could be processed or what could be in your case what could be written out of something, I just come to realize how structure like Karkar City is known for the old houses, but it's part of, I think it's more on as we progress, there are some houses that like every day I go back and forth to school because I am teaching at Karkar City College, and even the location of the school is let's say a historical itself, but there are old architectures or old houses that I think naguba na siya, and then just like you are not looking at a photograph, but you are looking at something that changes every day before your eyes, and you're looking into the concept of the punctum there, like if you want, because I am not really into writing, but it could be more on the analysis of it. Like I am looking into what we could process on the changes that a person looks see every day, like because it's common. Some old houses were not restored or are not restored yet, but some hamura kag nakakita changes, like but which is so if you're going to look at a picture of it, which is I believe many in the Cebuano Study Center because I used to go there when I do my research, and then look at the picture and how it looks today, it seems like there is this concept of what happened before or where does the story lie lie in the concept.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, great. I'm not sure if I almost feel like punctum might not be the term that might be useful to you. I don't know what the term is, but hearing you talk about this really makes me think, because it brings up questions of like cultural preservation, right? Na more like ang basis of cultural preservation is usually like you will retain it in the original style, right? And you will preserve it so that it looks the same way it did 50 years ago. I think a lot of cultural preservation decisions are based on that assumption. A certain notion of retaining it, capturing it at a certain moment of time, like you're thinking, photographing it, treating it as a photograph. Diba? It will not change. And that's what preservation is. But I think what you're bringing up are really like other questions we can ask about preservation. Like for people who actually live there, who pass by it every day, for them, does it matter that that thing be static or remain the same? Or is it actually better that it change? Where is meaningful place to be found? Is the old house more meaningful if it will be caught in time, or if it actually more meaningful if it changes with time? So I'm very interested in your research. For example, later on, like, will you be asking people who live in that town what they think versus like what tourists think? um, do the towns, like whose perspective matters? in other words, like where is the meaning in a place to be found? It brings up the question for me, like, is the point of preservation or even the archives to retain something and have it not change? Or is the point to find the spirit of that and to make sure that the spirit does not change? Something can really change physically, but the spirit remains the same, right? And sometimes we destroy that spirit if we insist that it look the same, right? The spirit is a dynamic thing. So I wonder sometimes if the spirit needs change rather than you stick it in. So I hope I didn't offend any cultural preservationists. But I think it really raises the question, even of the archives, Bea, like it makes me wonder about like, what does the Cebuano Study Center hope with the archives that it's using? Right now it's preserving it, but how do you preserve the spirit of it also, right? Which will need kind of like change.
Thank you, sir.
Sir Larry. We have a question from Ara. Ara is a literature student in USC. Hi, sir. What poetic work had the most impact on you, and could you explain why?
Sorry, what kind of
What poetic work had the most impact on you, and can you explain why?
um hard to choose. Give me a minute to think. Hmm, I'll give a number of answers. Because it's changed through the years. Uh, the very first poet I was intrigued by is someone called Stephen Crane. He actually wrote The Red Badge of Courage. And I saw some parts of his poems in a book I was flipping through in National Bookstore in Mango. Um, and his poems did not rhyme, and his poems did not have music, and they were very weird. They were very short. It looked like no other poems I had read before, and it made me question: Is this a poem? It was classified as poetry, but it didn't look like poetry. I've never really gone back to Stephen Crane before again, but I think that notion of like poem bunny, is this a poem? Actually was the very first poem that kind of moved me. The one that made me really get into poetry as a writer were the works of Mirna Peña Reyes. She's based in Dumaguete, and reading her poems about Dumaguete really gave me a sense that poems in English could be written about places that are very close to our home. That there was, for lack of the better word, it's called local color. The fact that you can write about the street that you live in, the fact that you can write about people that you know, is sometimes very hard to even imagine when you grow up in our educational system. We are always made to think that literature is about somewhere else. So I think it's very important to encounter work that's literally about people that you know. And for you as a writer to even try to attempt to write things about the street you live on, the house you live in. That's where interesting literature comes from. It does not come from this idea of what a poem sounds like or what a short story should be. It does not come from there. It comes from you looking at your life and saying, I want to put words to this. And even if you haven't read anything like it before, that is your job as a writer. Um, Sorry, I went there. I feel like I gave life advice, but like I think that's what I have to say. That's the poems that eventually moved me to be a writer.
Thank you, Sir Larry. Any other questions from the audience? Do you want to raise your hand, ask Sir Larry anything, or say anything to Sir Larry?
Even if it's not directly related to the talk, I mean, if there's something you wanna ask, we might as well while we are here. We have time.
I want to read a comment from uh, Sir Michael Carlo Villas. Thank you for your response. So in writing about Cebu, you are writing about a place in between. You may not live in Cebu, but Cebu lives in you. I think that is true. So
I
let
just,
me.
I don't know who is haunting who though, Bea. Um, I feel like Cebu is haunting me, but I also feel like I'm haunting Cebu via Zoom. Like I'm haunting it. It goes both ways. I hope.
We are happy you are hunting us. Let me end then with two questions that are related to each other. So I will just read them together. The first is from Clarissa Sevilla, um, a student also in USC, taking up literature. She asked, let me just scroll up because she sent it earlier. Okay. I'm not really one to vibe with poetry. Instead, I'm able to connect deeper to fiction. But I am a literature student, and I'd like to ask for suggestions or advice on how I can hone my poetic sensibilities so that I can gain a deeper appreciation for poems. And another question related to that is from Seth Lamoste. Good day, sir. What factors do you consider in writing poetry, and what points can you give for people aspiring to write poetic works?
Um, Great questions, because I think those are questions that all readers of fiction have. Especially if you usually read short stories or novels, right? And then you read poems and you're like, how do I even make sense of this? You know, one thing to maybe just some pointers to help you enjoy poetry. One way to think of it is as voice. It is beginning to ask, who is talking here? Where is this? Who is the persona here? So in fiction, it would be called character. Who is the character here? In poetry, it's usually called the persona or the voice. So think of it as voice, as one would a song. The other thing that I think really bothers fiction readers is that nothing happens in poetry. You know, uh, for the fiction writers are very, very obsessed with resolution. Like what happens next? Or like how will the problem get solved? Or like magkadayon ba ni sila? 'Di ba? Mo man ay mga questions sa fiction writer. The poet aspires for resolution, but I don't think the poet ever gets resolution. So if you notice, the best love songs, the most powerful poems, don't really solve the problem. What they do is shed light to it, and we get to understand what it means to lose a parent, to fall in love or out of love, to leave a place. We don't really know or are interested in what happens next. But with poetry, we're allowed to stay in that moment, and we're allowed to understand it a bit. And that's why I think we run to it, especially in times when we don't know what will come next. I suspect that's why poetry has gained popularity during the pandemic, for example, when there are moments of uncertainty. We run to poetry because they allow us to understand the situation a bit better. So, like when someone passes away or dies, or you fall in and out of love, that's why you run to love poetry, or to like, grief poetry, because someone else's grief or someone else's love makes you understand your own a bit more. Yeah.
Thank you, Sir Larry. Um, I
I
said
hope that encourages the fiction reader to try out. Ayaw kahadlok. Don't be afraid of poetry. Hugot-hugot ra na.
yes, Clarissa. okay. I said it was the last, but I was wrong. There are two more questions. One more question, and I'd like to call Miguel. He raised his hand earlier.
Yeah. Hi, Lar. Hi, Bea.
Hi, Mig.
So I'm just very curious because I'm also trying to like write poems that intertwines with history and especially national history and also my grandparents' family history. And I'm kind of curious, how can we write poems in such a way that the historical research doesn't overwhelm the poetry?
Hmm. Hmm. Um, because it can. Um, it's a question I feel of the ways in which you're approaching history. um, if you are approaching it as one should, in terms of research, then there's a certain amount of like digging that's happening. um, and it's like, you want to find out more, you want to know what it meant to live in that historical period, like those are necessary things you need. And I'm not sure if being overwhelmed is entirely bad. I would welcome the possibility and the pleasures of being overwhelmed. Maybe we should be overwhelmed by history, especially our kind of history that is very violent and very like hidden, and not everything is known. And it's, we have a history of 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 violence and dictatorship and power and the misuse of power. That is our history, and it is very overwhelming. The more you find out, the more difficult it is. And I even suspect like that's why people prefer not to know history, because it's easier to not know how difficult things were in 1915. We prefer to call it just like peacetime, when it was obviously not. So I would embrace that overwhelming feeling. Maybe the poet should rightfully be overwhelmed when that happens to you. The second thing that comes to my mind is to approach history in ways that deal with the materiality of it. What felt valuable to me is, for example, getting a historical document and doing blackout poetry with it. So just like erasing certain words or encircling certain words, or like using someone else's words, like a letter that your lolo might have written to your lola, and really just using those words to create a new poem. That is like a poetic way of encountering history. So unlike narrative or critical discourse that's interested in like finding out what happened really, that kind of like poetic move stays at the surface. So on one hand, it may feel like dua ramana, that's all just play. But I think that's precisely where poetic energy comes from. Play around with history, literally, in a way a poet would. So those I think would be like ways I would, yeah, overcome the quote unquote problem of being overwhelmed. Play it, surf it. Yeah, play it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Larry. And Miguel, looking forward to more poems from you. Congratulations on your recent publications.
Congrats, Miguel, on all you're doing.
So one more question from, I think our last question from you, Ernchua, Megan. Sir Larry, a question for you. How does a work where?
How does
How does a work where?
I wonder if that's a riddle of sorts that Megan is throwing at us. So let me try to answer with a riddle too. How does a work where? It works there, where it is, if it gets there, and it works here if it allows us, or if we allow it to come here. That's where the work works. So I hope that was not a typo, and I hope I that was an invitation to play. So I hope my answer makes sense to, or does not make sense to Megan. That is where the work is, Megan.
Thank you, Sir Larry. Megan replied, beautiful and not a typo.
Okay, great.
So I believe we have answered all the questions in the chat box. And just reminding everyone to fill up the evaluation form. The link is in the chat box. And we would like to thank Sir Larry for giving his time, his expertise, and his passion and his heart during this lecture. Allow me to read the citation, of our certificate of appreciation. The University of San Carlos Cebuano Studies Center presents the certificate of appreciation to Lawrence Lacambra Ypil for his lecture entitled What Could Have Been is a Photograph during the Vicente Sotto Lecture Series 2021, given this 24th day of April via Zoom. Signed by Father Jasraj Antoniapen, SVD, PhD, Vice President for Academic Affairs, and Hope Sabanpan, new PhD, Director of the Cebuano Study Center. May we all please give a virtual round of applause to Sir Larry.
Thank you so much, Bea. And thank you to everyone who came over and joined the room on a Saturday afternoon. No, this was such a pleasure. I was especially, like looking forward to this. I think it fills me with warmth to know that I really miss Cebu. So like this is the closest I am getting to Cebu. In a year. It's been great to see familiar faces. I am anticipating that a good number of you are actually in Cebu. And I feel like I want you to send it my regards almost. I really miss Cebuano English. Can I just say that? Like, I do not hear it. So, like, I really miss that English that I know comes from like a mix of Cebuano and English. So, it has been really, really wonderful for me to both hear it, and I would like to think I spoke a bit of it karon, no? So thank you for reminding me of the language that I actually come from. Yeah, thank you so, so much.
Thank you very much, Sir Larry, and I hope when you are here in Cebu again, you will make sure to visit us at the center.
I will.
Before we end, I'd like to announce our next speaker for May. I had to think what's after April. So May. Dr. Michael Culinain is our next speaker. The title is still will be announced later, so please just follow us on Facebook. So before we end, can I ask everyone to turn on their cameras if makaya sa inyong camera? Let's take a photo. Can I ask Clarissa to please take a screenshot? But first, I think I have to stop share. Okay.
Sure, miss.
Thank you, Clarissa.
So, hi everyone. I'd like to request everyone to please switch on their camera so that we can take a group photo with everyone in the Zoom chat right now. So let's give everyone some time to switch on their cameras.
I haven't tried this in a long time. It's the official end of an event, which means there has to be a group pic. So like I am very thrilled.
Okay, so I think we can start. There are only 17 people with their cameras on. Okay, now 16. Come on guys, don't be shy. Okay, wala na gyud. Okay, so everyone, at the count of 3, I want you guys to smile. So 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, let's have one more. One more. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, smile. All right. I'll send it to Miss Bea.
Thank you very much, Clarissa. And thank you everyone for this wonderful afternoon. See you next month. Thank you, Sir Larry.
Thank you.